There we go. Subcommittee on National Security, Illicit Finance, and International Financial Institutions will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled International Financing of Nuclear Energy. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. And I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Patrick's not going to have a statement? Okay, 5 minutes of opening statement. First, I'd like to welcome my colleagues and our witnesses to this hearing on international financing for nuclear energy. Clean nuclear power, such as that produced back in my district in Ameren's Callaway plant, accounts for over a quarter of the world's low-carbon electricity and nearly 20% of all electricity in our country. In the words of in the Department of Energy, and I quote, "Nuclear power is the most reliable energy source, and it's not even close," end quote. Nuclear is also one of the safest sources of power, with one analysis estimating that it has been less risky to human health than even wind or hydropower. Of course, some have tried to demonize nuclear energy in the past, arguing that the world will eliminate carbon emissions through renewable energy alone. The results have been catastrophic. Germany, for example, has abandoned nuclear power, while just next door, France uses it to produce 2/3 of its electricity. And what is the result? Germany's per capita emissions are nearly double that of France. And while German households saw gas prices soar by over 50% last year due to the country's reliance on Russia, the French are now lowering regional costs by exporting clean energy to the rest of Europe. Clearly, nuclear is essential to energy security. At the same time, we cannot limit its reach to advanced economies. For instance, half of sub-Saharan Africa lacks access to electricity, and the renewables-only crowd wants to keep it that way. This has opened up the door for China and Russia to explore nuclear cooperation, not just on the continent, but elsewhere in the developing world. It is past due for the United States to get back in the game and compete. Nuclear power provides us with a unique opportunity to push for a positive national security agenda in 2019. Republicans worked to create the China and Transformational Exports Program at Export-Import Bank, which allows the bank to compete more effectively against Chinese nuclear projects abroad. This will allow the U.S. to provide foreign countries with real options to power their development with abundant clean energy, rather than constantly browbeat them about climate change. I've been pleased to see XM engaging in several discussions on future nuclear deals around the world, from Asia to Europe to Latin America. Republicans in this committee have also pushed the World Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, to finally end their bans on nuclear financing, which fly in the face of those organizations' rhetoric on climate. These lenders should be active in emerging markets and developing nations, not sit idly by while China and Russia try to export inferior nuclear technologies. I've been pleased to see progress in our efforts to enlist the international financial institutions for this cause. Just last month, the U.S. and 19 other countries committed to tripling nuclear energy capacity globally. This pledge explicitly encourages the World Bank and regional development banks to include nuclear in their lending policies. EBRD has already signaled that it may consider opportunities to support nuclear power projects. While Republicans certainly have policy differences with this administration, our shared support for nuclear financing has been a welcome source of cooperation. I'm hopeful it will continue this year. For today's hearing, we took great care to ensure our panel reflects scientific expertise, and I'm pleased to see that many of our witnesses have engineering backgrounds. If we want to find genuine solutions to promote national security through nuclear energy policy, it needs to be fact-based and is free of outdated ideologies. I want to thank our witnesses again for appearing before us today. I look forward to the testimony. Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the Subcommittee on National Security, Illicit Finance, and International Financial Institutions, the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Beatty. 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing here today to discuss international financing of nuclear energy projects. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for also sharing their expertise when you talk about science and research. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say I have two who were at The Ohio State University. So thank you to our witness, McMurray, and thank you to our witness, Mr. Reinke, for all the work that you've done. As we know, international financial institutions, or IFIs, such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, I'm a stickler for, throwing out all the things without telling you what it is, the World Bank and the Multilateral Development Banks, MDBs, are central pillars of the global economic cooperation that promote international financial stability and development. In recent years, the IMF and the World Bank have expanded their focus, helping to develop countries respond to economic disruptions caused by COVID-19 pandemic, as well as addressing the climate change and its economic implications. The United States has led the charge in calling on the global community to meet the challenges of today. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has urged the World Bank to develop an evolution roadmap to respond to the global crises on climate change. The United States has also led efforts within the G7 and the G20 to support a $100 billion resilience and sustainability trust, or the RST, at the IMF that would advance climate resilience and financing for low and middle income countries. Notably, while the Congress has appropriated funds for the RST, these funds have not been authorized by this committee due to Republican members' opposition. To confront global climate crises, we must dramatically reduce the use of fossil fuels and transition to clean energy. As we also assess which alternative energy options to pursue, we must carefully and accurately consider every factor to ensure that we transition to energy sources that are best for the environment and for our global communities. Nuclear energy is certainly a better alternative to the more fossil fuel development and has a role to play in the clean energy and transition. Of course, this energy source is also not without its own unique hazards, which must be taken into consideration. Furthermore must be done to ensure that countries powered by nuclear energy are properly managed and disposing of their toxic radioactive waste, including the United States. Thank you again to our witnesses, and I look forward to your testimony. Struggling a little bit, I have an eye allergy, so thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Looks like the Ranking Member of the committee and Chairman are not here, so we'll move on and welcome our guests today to testify before us. Again, I want to thank each of you for waiting until this afternoon. Mother Nature showed that she is more powerful than Congress. We sometimes think that all power emanates from us, and once again, we're taught another lesson. It doesn't. Mother Nature can wield a stick once in a while and make us bend to her will as well, and so we did. I know Ms. Beatty and I both wound up having to come in this morning instead of yesterday. It's because of the weather, but we do thank all of you for waiting around this afternoon or coming this afternoon to testify before us. With that, we have Maria Korsnick. Ms. Korsnick is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Nuclear Energy Institute. Nicholas McMurray. Mr. McMurray is Managing Director of Nuclear and International Policy at ClearPath. Ben Reinke. Dr. Reinke is Vice President of Global Business Development at X Energy. And Timothy Judson. Mr. Judson is Executive Director at the Nuclear Information and Rescue Service. Each of you will have 5 minutes to speak, give your oral presentation or testimony without objection. Each of your written statements will be made part of the record. And just as a side note, those microphones in front of you move forward, so if you want to pull it close to you, sort of take a bite out of it. The gentleman on the end down there is taking down our discussion today, and sometimes if those microphones are not close enough, it's hard for him to record what you say. And so we'll take a thumbs up from him whenever we have a problem or need to stop. But anyway, please speak into the microphone and draw as close as you can. And with that, Ms. Korsnick, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your remarks. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. I'm Maria Korsnick, President and CEO of the Nuclear Energy Institute, representing more than 350 organizations in an industry that directly employs nearly 100,000 people throughout the United States. I appreciate the invitation to testify, and I thank Chairman Luetkemeyer, Ranking Member Beatty, and the entire subcommittee, as well as Chairman McHenry and Ranking Member Waters, for continuing to recognize clean nuclear energy as crucial to meeting our nation's national security, energy independence, climate, and environmental goals. Let me be blunt. Commercial nuclear technology was invented in the United States, and U.S. companies lead the world in innovating the next generation of nuclear. We operate the largest and highest performing fleet of reactors in the world. However, we are behind Russia and China when it comes to exports. Therefore, it is Russia and China that are building strategic 100-year partnerships and setting the standards for global nuclear safety. You see, when you export U.S. technology, we export world-leading U.S. standards on nuclear safety, security, and nonproliferation. The best way for us to raise global standards is for us to be the ones on the ground, safely building, operating, and maintaining U.S.-designed, NRC-reviewed nuclear power plants. Beyond the national security implications, when the U.S. builds nuclear plants around the world, we're reducing global carbon emissions and creating thousands of American jobs. Nuclear power exports are a win for American and global security, and win for American workers, and a win for the environment. My written testimony outlines several policy proposals that will help the United States compete and win in the global energy marketplace. But I want to highlight 3 crucial points. First, Russia is beating us in the global market, and China is not far behind. Russia is the world's dominant global nuclear supplier. Rosatom, Russia's state-owned nuclear energy conglomerate, currently has 70% of the global export market for new nuclear construction. A Russian-built reactor recently began operation in Belarus, and Russia is building reactors in Egypt, Turkey, Bangladesh, and other countries. Like Russia, China has designated nuclear energy exports as a strategic foreign policy priority. Nuclear energy has been included in China's Belt and Road Initiative since its launch in 2017. China now operates 55 reactors and last year was second only to the U.S. in total nuclear generation. With 22 more units under construction and 42 units planned, China's state-owned nuclear enterprise has an unmatched scale, and it's becoming increasingly aggressive in the global marketplace, including 2 recently completed reactors in Pakistan. Second, global demand for nuclear energy is unprecedented. Governments around the world recognize that by making clean, always-on nuclear energy a linchpin in their energy systems, they can decarbonize their electric grid and strengthen their energy independence, because energy security is national security. Before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we were already seeing robust growth in nuclear energy demand. Following the invasion, nations that had grown reliant on Russian gas realized just how vulnerable they had become. Evidence of increased demand is everywhere. At the recent COP28, which one headline declared the nuclear COP, 24 nations signed a pledge to triple global nuclear energy capacity by 2050. In the EU, where nuclear energy had once fallen out of favor, a majority of governments recently voted to include nuclear in the EU's net zero list of strategic technologies. And approximately 30 countries, 1/3 of which are in Africa, are now considering planning or starting nuclear power programs for the very first time. I meet with leaders from these countries regularly, and most of them want nothing to do with Russia or China. They want to work with the United States and our partners, but we must be able to at least come close to matching the deals that our competitors offer. And finally, we need to give U.S. companies the tools they need to compete and win against state-owned enterprises from Russia and China. The U.S. must place the same significant strategic value on nuclear energy exports as Russia and China do. We must support our companies with the necessary financing tools to compete and win. Russia offers terms and conditions that at present the U.S. cannot match. By enacting the International Nuclear Energy Financing Act and the other proposals offered in my written testimony, Congress can strengthen America's hand and help ensure the U.S. remains an influential participant in the global nuclear energy market, safeguarding our national security interests. The industry I represent looks forward to working with you to ensure our nation can take full advantage of all that nuclear energy has to offer. Thank you.
Very good. Mr. McMurray, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Luetkemeyer, Ranking Member Beatty, and members of the committee. My name is Nicholas McMurray, and I'm the Managing Director of International and Nuclear Policy at ClearPath. This committee is vital in financing the global deployment of American clean energy. Today, the U.S. aims to renew its global energy leadership. Recently, the U.S. and over 20 allies pledged to triple global nuclear energy capacity by 2050. This commitment recognizes that reliable energy, like nuclear, is necessary to reduce global emissions while meeting economic development goals. However, the International Energy Agency's 2023 World Energy Outlook shows that existing policies make this goal incredibly challenging. In particular, the IEA projects that existing policies would only allow for a roughly 48% increase. Tripling global nuclear capacity means deploying nuclear power plants domestically and building American reactors abroad. Thus, we need policy changes. I'll cover several topics today. First, the U.S. must remain competitive against China and Russia. Second, we must overcome financing obstacles for U.S. projects. And third, we must reform burdensome regulatory requirements. While the U.S. still has the world's largest domestic operating nuclear fleet of 93 reactors, the pace China is building reactors should be worrisome to anyone who wants the U.S. to remain a leader. Currently, China has 55 operating reactors and is actively building more, while the U.S. only has one commercial reactor under construction. It's obvious through China's Belt and Road Initiative and Russia's invasion of Ukraine that they want to exert their influence globally. They are both developing export markets and providing significant financial support for their nuclear deals. For example, Russia gave $25 billion in financing to Egypt, which was around 85% of the full project cost. And China recently announced it would provide the full cost of a new reactor, $4.8 billion, to Pakistan. This focus has led to China and Russia constructing 64 new reactors abroad since 2000. And since reactors operate for 60 years or more, those host nations will become dependent on China and Russia for decades. Fortunately, the U.S. private sector is up to this competitive challenge. The shale gas boom in America is a perfect example of successful public-private partnerships, and the advanced nuclear market could see similar success. Congress can provide further direction to various government agencies by developing a U.S. nuclear export strategy, supercharging U.S. export finance tools, and removing red tape that prevents the scaling of nuclear technology. Unfortunately, the current U.S. approach to exporting nuclear energy is fragmented. The process of exporting a reactor involves coordination among multiple entities, including Departments of State, Energy, Commerce, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Ex-Im Bank, DFC, the U.S. Trade Representative, the National Security Council, and others. Aligning these agencies is important, but innovative U.S. nuclear companies are not operating in a fair and open market as they must compete against generous state-sponsored financing. In fact, between 2016 and 2021, China's financing of all global energy initiatives outpaced the combined contributions of all significant Western-backed development banks. Leveling the playing field for clean energy exports will require thoughtful policy reforms. To that end, legislation such as the bipartisan International Nuclear Energy Act would develop a civil nuclear export strategy. And the International Nuclear Energy Financing Act would require the U.S. Executive Director at the World Bank to advocate for funding nuclear energy. The World Bank and other multilateral development banks play a significant role in the infrastructure planning worldwide, and they can be instrumental in increasing global nuclear deployment. Beyond financing, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission will almost certainly need to license a reactor design in the U.S. before another country would be willing to build it. However, even after the NRC licenses a reactor, it still must receive export approvals and be licensed by the other country. Therefore, an efficient and agile U.S. regulator is fundamental not only for domestic deployment, but also for ensuring U.S. competitiveness abroad. In conclusion, the U.S. needs to be the global leader in nuclear exports, and there are solutions to accomplish that goal. An all-of-the-above clean energy strategy is the only viable path for achieving global emissions reduction targets. The world must quickly deploy clean, reliable, and affordable energy like nuclear power, and if the world and other international financing institutions reassess their nuclear energy policies rather than simply saying no, we'll be on a clear path. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. McMurray. Next we have Dr. Reinke, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Luetkemeyer and Ranking Member Beatty, for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Benjamin Reinke, and I serve as X-Energy's Vice President of Global Business Development. X-Energy is a nuclear reactor and fuel design engineering company headquartered up the road in Rockville, Maryland, with over 400 employees and hundreds more contractors that are a part of our design team. At X-Energy, we manufacture TRISO-X fuel, which is our proprietary version of tristructural isotropic coated particle fuel. The safety and economic case for our reactors starts with TRISO-X. This fuel was originally developed by DOE and qualified through a series of experiments that validated TRISO's safety case. Under that program, irradiated TRISO particles survived tests at nearly 3,300 degrees Fahrenheit for over 12.5 days. This is why DOE calls TRISO the most robust nuclear fuel on Earth. Each pebble contains over 18,000 of these chia seed-sized TRISO particles in a graphite matrix. Our advanced high-temperature gas-cooled small modular reactor is called the XE100. It produces 200 megawatts thermal or 80 megawatts electric and has advantages in sustainability, economics, reliability, and safety over conventional reactors. The XE100 core, consisting of these TRISO-X pebbles, can never melt down, even in the worst-case accident scenario. We flow helium through the core instead of water and achieve much higher temperatures for operations than today's reactors. Our modular design allows the number of reactors to be matched to the needs of each customer, with up to 12 operating from a single control room. Importantly, the XE100 can load follow, making it ideally suited for pairing with renewables, with the ability to ramp between 40% and 100% power in only 12 minutes. I want to recognize the critical topic of this hearing and the importance of its timing. There is a global race underway for the development and, more importantly, the deployment of clean energy technologies. Decades have passed since the U.S. held its proper role as the global nuclear energy leader, and in that vacuum, Russian and Chinese state-owned enterprises have firmly established their positions. Today, China and Russia account for 70% of planned or under construction reactors worldwide. The good news is that the U.S. is positioned to jump back into the lead because of technologies like our XE100. Our first project will be deployed under DOE's Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, or ARDP, a program that matches private sector investment dollar for dollar to enable X-Energy to complete the design of the XE100, construct our first commercial-scale TRISO-X manufacturing facility, and license, construct, and commission our first plant for Dow, a 4-unit, 320-megawatt electric plant that will provide all of the steam and electricity required for Dow's Seadrift operations, a polyethylene manufacturing complex located in Seadrift, Texas. Our ARDP Fast Follower project is with Energy Northwest in Richland, Washington, for a project to develop a minimum of 4 reactors and up to 12 XE100 units on their project site. While there are many use cases for SMRs for utility deployments, 2 are the most dominant in driving demand today. The first is coal to nuclear conversion, and the second is data center demand growth. At X-Energy, we have seen growing evidence of customer interest from around the world. We have been paid to conduct studies across market segments and geographies, including integrated steel manufacturing, end-of-life coal plants, and hydrogen production, just to name a few. But don't just take my word for it. There is ample evidence that nuclear energy is back in vogue globally and that the fundamentals are better now than ever. DOE estimates that the U.S. will require an incremental 200 gigawatts of new nuclear by 2050. This ambition was carried forward by the administration to COP28, where it received support from an additional 21 nations, all pledging to triple nuclear capacity by 2050. The opportunity is enormous, yet major challenges remain. Number one, we must deploy domestically before we can sell internationally. My team and I hear this in the global nuclear marketplace every single day. In order to do this, we must remain committed to a fully implemented ARDP. We also must remain committed to a technology-neutral tax credit system, like what's found in the IRA that provides incentives for nuclear that are equal for the first time to renewables. And we must redevelop the U.S. nuclear fuel supply chain by ensuring there is sufficient funding for DOE's high-assay, low-enriched uranium availability program. Number two, we must remove barriers to entry for new advanced reactor technologies, first in the U.S. and then abroad, especially focusing on right-sizing regulatory requirements for these inherently safe advanced reactors. Number three, we must have all possible financing tools in the toolkit to support U.S. nuclear exports, which means adding nuclear to the list of technologies for which the U.S. Export-Import Bank can match Chinese loan terms, opening up the program to match Russian terms, and advocating aggressively for the World Bank to reverse its ban on providing nuclear loans. And number four, the U.S. must remember how to lead from the front again on nuclear energy. Thank you again for holding this hearing and continuing bipartisan support for the U.S. trajectory back to the front of the global nuclear energy leadership pack. We are not there yet, but we are gaining speed. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Reinke. Mr. Johnson, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Judson.
Chairman Luetkemeyer, Ranking Member Beatty, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Timothy Judson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, which is an organization, nonprofit environmental organization founded in 1978 to help grassroots organizations and individuals understand nuclear energy issues better and to advocate for a renewable energy future. The topic of today's hearing is part of an especially important conversation that's happening around the world, and it's really important that we're having this conversation. The world is eager for the U.S. to play a larger role in financing energy infrastructure for countries that are less developed than ours. In fact, the world needs that right now because of the global climate crisis. Unfortunately, the issue is, what do countries actually need financing for? And unfortunately for H.R. 806, the answer is that it's not for nuclear energy infrastructure. If we go forward with prioritizing financing for nuclear energy infrastructure at IFIs, we're actually going to miss the target. We'll be putting our eggs in the wrong basket because what countries actually need for energy finance is different. The reasons for that, there are a lot of reasons to oppose nuclear energy, and I list some of those in my written testimony. But unfortunately for my side in this debate, that's not the reason why IFIs haven't been financing nuclear power projects. The reality is that nuclear power projects, nuclear power plants, nuclear reactors, are too expensive, and they take too long, and they're too fraught with uncertainty for cost overruns, delays, and even cancellations than they can justify making loans for. There's too greater risk of default. And in fact, we've acknowledged this in our own country because we've had to use extraordinary means to finance nuclear energy projects in this country. The 2005 Energy Policy Act tried to kickstart a whole renaissance of nuclear energy in this country by providing $18.5 billion in loan guarantees to basically insure the industry against defaults. And states have offered construction work in progress financing to basically have ratepayers pay the cost of financing for nuclear projects before they ever generate any electricity. And still, the Energy Policy Act of 2005, while it led to 28 proposals for new reactors around the country, 24 of those never started construction. 2 of them were canceled after $9 billion was spent, and the other 2 that are now being finally completed cost over $30 billion, are over 7 years behind schedule. And the Georgia Public Service Commission staff had to testify last summer that there's no net benefit to the project at this point for Georgia ratepayers. We're asking other countries that have less wealth than us to take on this financial risk. Now, we've heard a lot of claims today about the fact that this is all going to change, that nuclear power is going to become more affordable, that they're going to be able to build reactors faster. The trouble is that there's no evidence for this. There's been no SMRs or other advanced reactors built in this country. None of them even have their designs approved yet. And as we've heard, other countries aren't going to go forward with that until they've been demonstrated. And so we're talking about asking the international financial institutions to prioritize funding these projects rather than other things. Now that's going to miss the mark because other countries need infrastructure now. They don't need infrastructure in 20 years. And in fact, what we just saw happen at the Global Climate Conference in Dubai was, yes, there were 22 nations that stepped up and said that we need to triple nuclear energy by 2050, but there were 130 nations that stepped forward to say we need to triple renewable energy and double energy efficiency by 2030. Now, if we triple nuclear energy by 2050, that's not even going to be as much electricity as renewable energy generates worldwide today. Now, to be clear about why this is the case, you can look at some of the reports that have been published claiming that we're about to enter into a global nuclear renaissance. Now, a report by Third Way published in 2022 claimed that there was a tripling of the global market for nuclear energy, but it was based on an electricity price of $90 a megawatt hour. That's less than half the actual cost of nuclear power plants that are being developed now at $180 a megawatt hour. But it's also significantly greater than the cost of wind and solar at $50 and $60 a megawatt hour. Now, the International Energy Agency issued a report last week that confirmed that we are on pace to be able to reach a tripling of nuclear energy of renewable energy by 2030. The barriers are actually that countries need more access to financing. And so that's really where the US can play a critical role for the rest of the world and show real leadership. But we shouldn't be, if we get into a debate about whether we should be competing with Russia and China on nuclear power, we're going to be talking about striking a fight over the smallest piece of the pie. I'll conclude my remarks.
Gentleman's time's expired. Okay, we go to the question and answer period here. I'll start. Thank each of you for your testimony today. Mr. McMurray, you talked in broad terms of some of the concerns that we have with China and Russia filling the void that we left when we basically decided not to participate at our previous level with regards to helping other countries find nuclear answers to some of their questions. You guys have talked about the greatness of nuclear from the standpoint of solving a lot of problems on a worldwide basis. Can you elaborate a little bit on that from the standpoint that Mr. Judson said it doesn't work? He doesn't believe it's cost effective. Would you like to give some information and some testimony to offset that?
Yeah. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for your leadership on this committee. We need a wide variety of clean energy technologies, nuclear being one of them. We've seen China and Russia control the global marketplace on nuclear exports recently. So these projects are being built. The question is now, can the US regain its global leadership on nuclear energy? And we're gonna need all of the above for this, and because countries are gonna be interested in building whatever clean energy resources they have available. And so if US institutions such as EXIM and DFC are not proactively going out to support these projects, and if the World Bank and other multilateral development banks are not supporting these projects, countries that are expected to increase their demand for energy will search for financing elsewhere. And we've seen that happening right now with China and Russia.
Okay, Dr. Reinke, you represent a company that's producing a new kind of nuclear facility. Mr. Judson said it's not tested and not able to be implemented yet. Would you like to discuss that a little bit, see what you've got to say about that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. A couple of important things to note. One is that pretty much all of the nuclear technologies under development today have a pedigree of having been tested at a pilot scale in a test reactor, or in some cases commercially in the past. Now, many of these technologies were extremely promising, and we developed them first here in the United States, typically tested in the Idaho desert, although many other places at Department of Energy national laboratories, we also tested reactors. All of those proved very useful in understanding the basic physics and understanding also what some of the major economic challenges would be to bringing those reactors to market. Today, we have a large fleet of large light water reactors in the United States and abroad, and that technology has proven to be very useful in a very successful program across the world to build those reactors. Our technology is one of many that has been tested and then demonstrated at a commercial scale multiple times around the world. Today, the Chinese government operates the only commercial high-temperature gas-cooled reactor after a long development program to try to get into first place with that technology. Ours is simply picking up where those left off and taking the modern tools that we have available today to have a better, more economic fuel and a better, more economic reactor.
Okay, each of you have mentioned the fact that we're losing the competitive race with Russia and China with regards to nuclear, which gives them an edge when it comes to international relationships on a geopolitical basis around the world. And part of this comes from the fact that the IMF and the World Bank, and even to a certain extent Ex-Im Bank, are not necessarily, or haven't necessarily in the past, been very active with regards to financing nuclear stuff. It seems to be turning. There seems to be an awareness now that they need to be financing this. Ms. Korsnick, would you like to comment on that just a little bit?
Yes, thank
How
you.
we can improve that part of the
Sure.
puzzle?
Yeah, and I'd like to give a shout out to Chair Lewis of the Ex-Im Bank. I think she is absolutely open to nuclear conversations and financing. But to your point, I think to level the playing field between the U.S. and these state-owned enterprises, we really need to enhance Ex-Im Bank's offering. I know we give some examples in my written testimony. But we have to enhance the bank. We also have to catalyze private financing. And then I would say more a coordinated sort of whole of government approach, right? It's going to take commerce and state, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Some of this financing that would be helpful is that front-end financing, the part where you're doing feasibility studies. It doesn't cost a lot, but it gets your foot in the door. Right? And so we really have to look at how do you start that relationship with that country that's hungry to build this technology, and we need to get the U.S. established in a leadership.
Okay, is there a prohibition right now against, like the World Bank, IMF, financing those kind of preliminary studies?
Yes, feasibility studies are difficult to get financed.
Okay, so what you're suggesting, it'd be nice if they went along and started to do that, and we, by backstopping this with some support, would be able then to hopefully allow them to purchase down the road our own nuclear plants. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, and it could be a combination of TDA, DFC, XM. We have to just look at that front end so that, as I said, we're getting the U.S. established.
Very good. My time's expired. Thank you very much. With that, I recognize the ranking member, Ms. Beatty, from Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you to all the witnesses for being here. Let's shift and let's talk about implications of changing the IFI policy. Let's go to you, Mr. Judson. The international financial institutions do not currently finance new nuclear power generation projects. Can you discuss the ramifications of the IFIs changing their internal policies to allow for it? And for example, safety and security measures, oversight, et cetera. How feasible is all of this?
Sure. Well, I think it really depends on whether the nuclear industry can actually produce a product that they'd be able to finance, and that other countries would be able to justify buying. The reality is that what we're seeing in terms of the trends with new reactors in the U.S. Isn't encouraging for that. For instance, the furthest along of these new designs was the NuScale Voyager SMR. That has been worked on for 20 years. They proposed their first project in 2015, the Carbon-Free Power Project in Idaho, and originally in 2016 they were projecting a price for that reactor, which would have been a 12-reactor, 600-megawatt power plant, for $3 billion. Now that would have been a pretty impressive accomplishment, but as the years went on, NuScale had to keep on adjusting its estimated price. And so by the time the project was canceled in November of last year, the cost had tripled to $9.3 billion for a 460-megawatt power plant. And they were already 4 years behind their original proposed schedule. And they hadn't even broken ground on the project, much less gotten it approved. And so, I think the industry is reckoning with, can they actually, is small actually better than the large reactors that have already proven too unaffordable, even in the U.S. At $9.3 billion, NuScale's price would have been the equivalent of $20 million a megawatt. That's more expensive than the Vogtle reactors that are being completed now in Georgia. And that's before ever breaking ground. And what we know from experience is that nuclear projects get more expensive as you start to build them. And so that's, I think, the real struggle with answering this question about what IFIs would do, is whether the industry can produce a product that they could actually finance or that countries would actually buy. I think the reality, what we're seeing is that, there were 507 gigawatts of renewable energy brought online last year. That's 25% more capacity than the entire nuclear industry worldwide. And the International Energy Agency projects that that's going to increase potentially to over 900 gigawatts a year by the end of this decade. And so while we're talking about exporting a few nuclear reactors around the world, the energy market is much huger than that. And so if we're gonna stake our international energy financing policy around this narrow share of the market, then we're gonna miss the boat with the huge market for renewable energy and related products and services that's already developed. And by the way, there are U.S. companies that are in those businesses. They just wouldn't be, what they have to offer just wouldn't be prioritized for international finance, under this legislation.
That's one of his nuclear deals here, so.
Can you tell me about this?
Yes, ma'am. That is a triso pebble. So it's made of graphite. Now, this one is not bearing any uranium, in case you're wondering. But in general, those would be bearing uranium. So there are very small chia seed-like sized particles. Those particles are made of uranium oxycarbide. It's a chemistry that was invented here in the U.S. by the Department of Energy and its national labs. And then we wrap that in 4 layers of alternating high-temperature tolerant ceramics. Why does that matter? Ceramics don't melt. So when you take a ceramic material like what that is made of, and on the inside you've got silicon carbide, you get a very robust layer. And that layer allows the fuel to run up to very high temperatures without failing, and it maintains the integrity of those teeny tiny pressure vessels, basically obviating the need for the large, sort of large concrete steel vessel that you see on reactors today. So we pack 18,000 of the little chia seeds into that graphite matrix that's in your hand, and 220,000 of those pebbles go into our reactor. So it is a small modular reactor, but it's not that small. And ultimately, that's how we make 80 megawatts electric power, and that's what we'll do for Dow with our first project before the end of the decade.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to pass this to Mr. Foster, our scientist. I'm not doing any of that. There you go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Beatty. With that, we go to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, who's the chairman of the Small Business Committee. Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to get that and throw it and see what happens with it. Nuclear power is a viable clean energy source that many of my constituents, and I understand firsthand as Comanche Peak Nuclear Plant is located in the rural part of my district in Glen Rose, Texas. For years, this 2-unit nuclear fuel plant has been supplying energy to Texans by powering over 1 million homes and around 500,000 homes during peak usage times. Nuclear power in the United States is one of the safest of all energy sources, even compared to other low-carbon options. I've always supported utilizing an all-of-the-above energy approach for the U.S. to compete on the world stage, which includes expanding the United States nuclear energy profile. As a global leader in the energy industry, we must ensure bad actors like Russia and China do not dominate nuclear construction because energy security is part of our national security. So, Mr. McMurray, could you elaborate on the importance of strengthening our nuclear portfolio at home and abroad? And how does a strong nuclear profile improve domestic energy security?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Having a wide variety of nuclear technologies helps us on the international market. So the large reactors that operate in your district, the other reactors coming online in Georgia, the advanced reactors that Ben is developing, as well as the variety of other technologies, gives us more options for exporting for different countries that may not want a large reactor. They might only require a smaller reactor. And so supporting the domestic industry to demonstrate these helps the U.S. be more competitively internationally. As for doing that, that's where we have things like ensuring we can build them, the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, other policies to bring those reactors online, improving the regulatory environment to also support some of these new technologies that have different fuels or coolants or safety cases. And then on the international side, opening up those financing opportunities from DFC or XM or the World Bank to build that market and build the expertise so then when these companies have that line of sight to be able to export their technologies.
All right, the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation have been looking to bolster their nuclear footprint in other countries across Europe and South America Africa, and South Asia. These bad actors are using the global nuclear energy market to increase their profile and influence in countries that are in need of sound energy infrastructure. And the problem is that the reactors being built in these countries by the Russians and the Chinese are incredibly more dangerous than the technology and reactors used by the United States and Japan. So we cannot allow our enemies to grow their influence in vulnerable nations and allow these countries to become reliant on hostile actors and unsafe technology. So, Ms. Korsnick, can you expand on how the Chinese and Russians' nuclear expansion projects are a risk to certain regions and how this will impact U.S. national security? And then lastly, how can we mitigate the risk imposed by the Chinese and the Russian nuclear energy?
Yes, sir, thank you for your question. Actually, I think we just watched this play out when you saw Europe very dependent on Russian gas and Russia decide to close that pipeline. And everybody realized that they were in dire need of an asset that Russia controlled. So when we talk about Russia building in other countries, it's not because out of the goodness of their heart they feel like helping you build a nuclear plant. It's because they'll build it, they'll operate it, and they'll be in charge of it. And so they really are doing this strategically, that they, in fact, control the energy supply. And I think we don't have to look any further to what we just saw play out after the invasion of Ukraine to understand their intentions. In terms of what we can do about it, to finish that thought, we need to be relevant. And the way we get relevant is you play the game. You get out there. You have a technology that people want, and they want to do business with you. They already want to do business with us. What we need is to bring our technology to the fore and have people like Exim Bank and some of these other financing institutions help us get this technology to our allies.
Thank you. The business of nuclear financing abroad is a key tool in providing our allies with safe, reliable energy. We've talked a little bit about that. This is also a critical step in countering Chinese and Russian influence. So in 2019, Republican members of this committee worked to create the China and Transformational Exports Program at the Export-Import Bank, which allows the bank to offer competitive financing terms to counteract Chinese financing of nuclear technology abroad. So we must ensure Exim Bank can continue nuclear assistance programs and projects abroad to ensure that countries can thrive on safe, reliable energy without malign influence. So quickly, Dr. Reinke, how do you think the Export-Import Bank can be most effective in supporting the growth of the nuclear power and technologies here in the U.S.?
Thank you for the leadership that this committee has shown on trying to help Exim get more aggressive in the marketplace vis-a-vis China. One of the most important things to do would be to explicitly add nuclear to the list of technologies that is available for the Chinese exemption to try to be able to match terms in the marketplace for offerings against what the Chinese may be putting together. And the second thing that could be done is to basically extend that authority to a Russian offering as well.
I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. With that, we go to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, who is one of our few, if not only, scientists here who could probably have a really high-level conversation with our witnesses today, and the rest of us will just sit and watch. But Mr. Foster, recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, and I had to thank X Energy for a very interesting, I think it was during COVID, we had a very interesting Zoom with your CEO, Mr. Sell?
Mr. Sell, Clay Sell.
Mr. Sell, yeah. And I have a lot of respect for your technology. I also agree with Mr. Judson that the challenges to nuclear are largely economic. I have been very surprised over the last decade to see the really remarkable drop in the cost of particularly wind energy and solar. And the competition long-term to nuclear is not just, you can't just compare the cost of adding 1 or 2 windmills or solar cells to your grid. You have to have a full replacement, including base load. And so that means the real cost comparison should be with renewables plus energy storage, or renewables plus enough grid transmission that you can effectively average over very large geographic regions. And either adding the extra grid or the extra energy storage is not cheap. So, Mr. Judson, what is the current, if you have to solve the problem without nuclear, without base load, what is the additional cost associated with putting an all-renewable solution on the grid right now? How much extra would you have to build? How much storage would you have to build and pay for?
Sure. Well, I think that's something that actually needs to be studied in detail. But what we've seen preliminarily, for instance, there was a really important study that was published in 2016 called "Renewable Prosperous Maryland" by the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. And they took as their goal for the study was to evaluate the feasibility of getting to a net zero emissions grid by 2050 for the state of Maryland, which doesn't have a tremendous amount of resources for space and other things, with renewable energy. And so they looked at all of these questions. It was very clear that, the wind and solar balance each other very well in terms of day and night and seasonally. And that the amount of, when you think about the grid as a whole, you're not just thinking about the grid in terms of, wind and solar power plants generating electricity, not just about storage, but a whole array of grid resources, including demand response and flexible demand and microgrids, and in battery store, and energy stored in batteries in cars. And what they found is that with a doubling of the economy of Maryland by 2050, an increase in population that matches that, or not double, but an increased population, that the actual cost of a renewable energy system for the state of Maryland would be substantially less than the status quo today, with 100% renewable energy.
Okay, yeah, I mean, this is the right level to have the discussion. I should also say that I'm very impressed by your first application of using the process heat, using this for process heat for other things. That is, I think, one of the really important missing parts in solving the climate crisis, is there's a lot of fossil fuels that get burned for industrial process heat. And technologies like yours are sort of unique in making a large amount of very high temperature process heat. Can you say a little bit about the other markets that you're looking at aside from electricity generation?
Yes, you recognized, I think, a very important piece of the puzzle. In the United States, roughly 25% of the energy emissions that we account for across the board come from heavy industry. And these are the fundamental building blocks of our modern society. So at Dow's facility, as you discussed, we are helping to decarbonize a polyethylene plant where we make products that go into solar cells. They make products there that, for example, provide the insulation and jacketing for high voltage transmission lines. So things that we need across the board in the United States. In addition to the opportunities for a manufacturing plant like that, they're really pretty broad. I'll give you a handful. So we've conducted study work for a large integrated steel manufacturer in the United States. And while that customer isn't ready to pull the trigger yet, they've had very promising results in integrating both the process heat and the electricity for large manufacturing products. We also have looked at mining applications. And we think of mining as hard rock mining, but there are a lot of other types of mining that form building blocks in the world where you have to be able to provide a dry product at the end.
Okay, and the last thing I'd like to close on is the national security aspect, because for dual-use technologies, there is a national security interest in subsidizing. For one recent example of this are drones, for example. We are suffering greatly for the fact that the drone market is dominated by the Chinese. We would have been better off as a country to have subsidized the drone market so that we would dominate there. So how do we think about these dual-use technologies? In 1 second left, Ms. Korsnick, could you say a little bit about how you think about that?
Well, absolutely, and I think it was stated earlier, it's not whether or not nuclear plants are going to be built. It's whether or not the United States is going to build them. And if you look at it that way, anything that we can do to encourage our fantastic technology and our strong safety standards makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. With that, we go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Mr. Musser is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and sincere thanks to all of you for being here. It's certainly interesting, an important subject. So I'm from Pennsylvania. In my district, we do have the Berwick Susquehanna Nuclear Power Plant. We've got several plants in Pennsylvania. Throughout Pennsylvania, we utilize nuclear, coal, natural gas, wind turbines, solar, thermal, hydro, very diverse, all of the above, but also all of the below, as I like to remind. So in this discussion, certainly focusing on nuclear energy, and it's the broader aspects of energy strategy. We're hearing about hitting capacities, these data centers, the amount of new levels of capacity that are necessary, that are really on the verge of perhaps being a very big problem, where we simply cannot develop due to the levels of overall energy made available for business and homes and such. So what I'd like to know is the regulatory environment for nuclear. Just how darn challenging is it? I mean, is it to the point that it's making it just very, very difficult for new nuclear plant developments? Because as we all know, there's not many nuclear plants in development. And that's a second question. There's a couple maybe in the United States, I understand. But I'll go to you, Mr. McMurray. If you could tell me what you think about the regulatory environment for nuclear plant development.
Yeah, thank you, Representative. So the current regulatory framework is designed around the large reactors that operate in the U.S. today. For the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's requirements, decades of operating experience for large light water reactors. They are not designed for the new generation of reactors like Dr. Reinke's company that use different fuels and coolants and safety cases. So the TRISO fuel, for example. The NRC is working to modernize this, which is important, and that's really an opportunity where the U.S. can also be a global leader, where if you have countries that are looking to build some of these new technologies, the Department of Energy and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission can really take a proactive role for the education on the technical side or the education on the regulatory side.
So does the regulatory environment of the U.S. affect the financing, the international financing that takes place? I'll ask you, Mrs. Korsnick. Ms. Korsnick.
Yes, thank you for the question. Yes, I would say the performance of our regulator matters worldwide. And why do I say that? Because many of the other countries are looking to see whether our regulator approved whatever technology that you're talking about as they embark on it. So if our regulator is sluggish and slow and inefficient, and it causes it much longer for us to get these products to the market, it affects what we can do in the market.
Okay. So a nuclear plant, ours in Berwick, for instance, is 2,500 megawatts. Building one, financing it, having an ROI, how feasible is that? Is that right now considered a worthwhile investment in this regulatory environment? I'll ask you. Sorry, I can't see your name.
Okay, me? Yes. The question is a great one. There are two ways to look at this. Number one, today in the United States, we are bringing 2 reactors online that are large light water reactors, and there are certain markets where that is doable. And it has taken a tremendous amount of effort to get back into the game. It was about 30 years before that when we last deployed a new reactor from scratch. Those muscles had atrophied. Now, on the other hand, there are many of our competitors that are developing smaller reactors. Now, when you look at that question that you asked on ROI, and you take a reactor that's of the size of the plant that you have, right? Those plants today would probably cost somewhere in the range of $20 to $30 billion for a couple of big units to deploy. Meanwhile, smaller reactors that are about an order of magnitude less would be somewhere in the range of about an order of magnitude less on the cost as well. So just to make the math simple, let's say you took a $25 billion reactor and you compared it to a smaller reactor that cost $2.5 billion. The amount of money that you have to raise in that project is phased over the life of the project. So my business development team does this on a regular basis. You start with studies that are not very expensive. They're on the order of hundreds of thousands of dollars, trying to figure out whether or not there's a match and if a site is licensable from a nuclear perspective. You phase that in steps, each one being roughly an order of magnitude in spend as you go through the life of the project. For a notional X-energy project today, for the early ones, they'll be about 7 years in length. And that's a relationship where every year you decrease the risk of the project and you increase the spend. The type of level I'm talking about in spending is what we're used to doing with heavy industrials today. Dow, for example, has a major capital budget where they allocate resources on that regular basis.
Thank you.
It's absolutely
I have to
bite-sized.
yield back. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we recognize the gentlelady from California, the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Waters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Judson, I was just talking with my staff about, and I remembered very well, the accident at 3 Mile Island nuclear facility. That impression was reinforced when negligence contributed to the 1986 disaster at Chernobyl. And more recently, an earthquake in Tsunami caused the 2011 accident at the Fukushima nuclear plant. And today, Putin has repeatedly bombed nuclear facilities around Ukraine. Certainly, we understand that most power generation from nuclear energy is safe. Nearly 20% of the electricity in the United States is generated by nuclear. And our witnesses from the nuclear industry have described and is an improvement over fossil fuels in terms of carbon emissions. But that doesn't mean that we must ignore the potentiality of catastrophic effects that disasters in these plants can cause, further due to negligence, intention, or natural disasters. Can you please comment on the essential safety aspects that would need to be considered and assured before any international financial institution invested the billions of dollars and decades required to develop one of these plants, these projects?
Yes, thank you for the question, Ranking Member Waters. I think that, and I'm glad to hear some recognition of this from the rest of the panel, that at the bare minimum, that we should have, that our own nuclear safety regulator, the NRC, should have approved these designs for construction and operation in the US. And preferably, before we start exporting these products to other countries, we should have a demonstrated track record with them here in the US before we start selling them to other countries. And I think that the situation in Ukraine certainly shows, in the long-term picture, why we also need to be really wary about prioritizing exporting nuclear reactors to other countries. Namely, that we can't guarantee whether those countries are going to be involved in a military conflict decades down the road, and whether the U.S. is going to get drawn into a military conflict in order to protect these facilities that could cause widespread environmental damage to those countries. There's also, especially in times of war, you can imagine that the countries with nuclear power plants, if they're being invaded or if there's a civil war, that those facilities could also become more vulnerable to theft of nuclear materials from them. In addition to that, I think what we've also seen in Ukraine in particular is, beyond the dangers to the nuclear power plants themselves, Russia has staged its military operations out of the Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plants because they know that Ukraine won't attack them there, because the danger to their own country is too great. And so the national security vulnerabilities that are created by the existence and operations of these facilities and the nuclear waste that they create is not something to be taken lightly. And I think we in the US, sort of tend to dismiss these issues out of hand because we haven't been bombed the way that Ukraine has been. We haven't had our infrastructure used against us in the way that Ukraine has. But I think when we're talking about prioritizing finance of nuclear energy projects for other countries, this is absolutely something that we need to think about, and it has national security implications for our own country as well.
Well, thank you very much. And I just wanted to raise the question of safety because I don't think we can take the development of nuclear plants lightly. Everything that I learned about Chernobyl, the earth was contaminated. We still don't know how many people eventually died. We know that many of them were harmed. And so we have to be very careful. And if, these bombings, and I have to find out a little bit more, really do take place, you could have massive destruction. And so that worries me. And again, I'm pleased that we're holding this hearing and that we're talking about it, but this is an opportunity for those who remember Chernobyl to caution all of us about taking the development of nuclear lightly. Thank you so very much.
Lady yields back. That will go to the gentleman from Iowa. Mr. Nunn is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for our panel being here today and hearing an issue that is important not only to the world, but to my home state of Iowa, a place where most of our energy comes actually from wind, coal, and gas, but nuclear has played a part in our success growing up. The facts are pretty simple, friends. Energy security equals America's national security. We've witnessed over the past 3 years the need of U.S. energy independence now, perhaps more than ever. In fact, Russia's invasion of Ukraine continues to disrupt global natural gas prices, and Hamas's brutal attack on Israel are jeopardizing oil exports throughout the Middle East. Meanwhile, this administration continues to prioritize a political green agenda that can and is hindering America's producers. In my home state, the Hawkeye State, we understand the importance of energy independence. We are champions of energy production at all of the above levels, meaning that we have many ways that we're trying to drive energy here in the United States. And I believe that Congress, Mr. Chairman, must act proactively for the future of America's energy. Nuclear energy is often overlooked as a source of safe, clean, and renewable fuel. Lack of consensus, as we've just heard here, surrounding nuclear energy has stalled our implementation of efforts here in the United States. And so when we fail to get our energy sector up on par, our adversaries rapidly develop, export, implement, and undermine the energy capabilities we have right here in America. So therefore, I'd like to jump right into it and thank the witnesses for joining us. Ms. Korsnick, you are the President and Chief Executive of Nuclear Energy Institute. My first question here is, in your expert opinion, is Russia currently selling small nuclear reactors, or SMRs, to our NATO allies?
They have small modular reactors. I'm not aware that they've sold them yet.
Understood. Does China see the production and export of SMRs as a critical component to their Belt and Road Initiative?
Yes, I believe they see the export of large and small as part of their Belt and Road Initiative.
So in short, it's safe to say that countries around the world, including many of our NATO allies, are looking to Russia and China to provide them this technology.
That's correct.
Can the U.S. currently offer our NATO allies an alternative to what Russia and China are putting on the market?
Yes, we have an active, in Poland, for example, we have active contracts to sell U.S. technology reactors to Poland, also in Romania, and there's an open tender in the Czech Republic.
Very good. Do you believe that we as the United States need to be doing more to help lead in this area so that it's U.S. and allies versus our adversaries leading in this area?
Absolutely.
Now, there was some conversation earlier. Technology has changed quite a bit since Chernobyl. You were working in this industry. Do you believe that current nuclear facilities, particularly those that are being produced here in the United States, bear that same risk, or has technology helped to mitigate a number of the issues that were raised?
I've been in the nuclear industry for 37 years. I operated and maintained power plants for over 30 of those years. I would live next to any nuclear plant we have in the United States, perfectly safe and perfectly good to export our technology. We should be very proud of U.S. technology. We operate the best in the world, had a greater than 90% capacity factor for all nuclear plants in the United States for over 20 years. And you don't do that because you got lucky. You do that because you're damn good.
I think it's safe to say not only would you be safe, but you probably have a little bit more money in your pocket as well because your energy would be lower, produced right here in America. I appreciate that. Dr. Reinke, I'd like to turn to you as Vice President of Global Business Development at X Energy. Does nuclear energy supremacy mean national security here in the United States?
Yes.
What does the U.S. stand to lose if we allow our adversaries to lead on nuclear energy implementation?
So I think we've already seen this play out, as Maria Korsnick rightly pointed out. For the last 30 years, we've mostly abdicated our position in global exports of nuclear technology, and we also, for the most part, abdicated our position in the development of new technologies. So we've seen China and Russia jump ahead of the United States in the deployment of technologies in their own countries, as well as selling those abroad. Today, that means that we have relationships that exist between developing nations often, but also others that have been developed already, that exist now, they have for 20 years with Russia or China. That puts us at a geopolitical and geostrategic disadvantage.
I want to take that one step farther, Doc, because you're absolutely right. What happens in Russia and China to undermine this also has an impact to my farmers back in Iowa. And while we have wind power, we've got water power, coal, and natural gas, does this have an impact on everyday Iowans and everyday Americans if left unchecked?
Yes, absolutely. But it also means there's an opportunity for your constituents. And I think there's a great opportunity for reactor sales here in the United States. We were discussing just a little bit ago about what it takes to deploy a new reactor. It's not as big of a bite size as what we've had to deal with in the past. And I think you're beginning to see that play out. In fact, one of the utilities that operates in Iowa has put in its IRP and in two of its other state territories, South Dakota and Montana, that would be Northwestern Energy, a plan for the deployment of roughly a 320 megawatt electric small modular reactor plant.
That's excellent. Thank you very much. I yield back the remainder of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time's expired. Then we go to the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. Pedersen, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here for this very important discussion. We don't usually get to talk about nuclear energy here in the Financial Services Committee. The reason why this is something that I think about often is because I have a 4-year-old son. He's turning 4 this Friday. And when I think about the future that he's going to grow up in, and one of the most urgent threats that we face is climate change. Nuclear technology is an essential piece of the puzzle as we transition to a carbon-free energy grid. There are some significant barriers, though. When I talk to leading experts who are in the fight on researching technologies to address the climate crisis and alternatives, when I've asked if nuclear energy will be a key part of this, their reluctancy is around how costly it is. And if we are actually going to be able to deploy the necessary investments for nuclear energy and meet the needs in a fast enough time. And so a few things, we want to make sure that we're going to be responsible and protect our workers and put these safeguards in place. And also we are in a race against time. So quickly, what are some considerations that we should have, Ms. Korsnick, about labor protections as you have overseen a site, you know well what we should be considering if we're going to actually fund nuclear investments and what we can do to protect workers.
Thank you very much for your question. I guess I'll start by talking about how strong the relationship is between the nuclear industry and the labor industry. We have very strong support from the labor unions. We have had it since the original reactors were built. We continue that relationship as they maintain the assets that we have today, and they look very forward to continuing to work on the new builds for the future. If there was a concern on labor, either how they were treated or concerns about safety, we would not have the strong labor relationship that we have today. So I would just say rest assured, we have a very strong partnership, and that partnership continues. I'll also reflect on several times that when the comment has come up relative to cost, I would just say, let's look at some countries that didn't stop building, and South Korea is a great example. They continued building, and as they build, the cost continues to come down. The challenge we have in the United States is we stopped building for 30 years. You don't stop building for 30 years and then start again, and you come right out of the gate, everything's perfect. It's not. It takes time. The DOE report on new reactors, in fact, showed about a 50% reduction in cost over the 5 to 6 new builds of a kind. So I think we need to step back and say the United States has proven time and again that we're really good when we focus and we build, and the more we build, the better we'll get.
Thank you for addressing that. Another key piece, since we're talking about costs and our ability to move as quickly as possible, some things that have, even when we look at housing, so many of these, the barriers that we face are around permits and local municipalities. What can we do to help support our local communities who might actually need to be a target for investment for nuclear technology? And then what else did I want to ask you? Just making sure that we're actually investing in modernizing the grid now to make sure that we're ready, because as we've had an increase in a demand to use electric energy, we actually don't have the transformers and we don't have the grid to actually rise to the occasion.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I'll begin by saying, as you're pointing out, it's not just the generation source, but it's the whole grid that you need to take a look at, and you mentioned some of that infrastructure. One of the values of adding nuclear to the grid, and the gentleman mentioned it earlier, he called it base load, but we have intermittent sources. That's great. We're not trying to say that intermittent sources aren't needed or useful, but you do need that round-the-clock resource to provide power around the clock. And study after study has shown that if you take the wind and solar and you add nuclear to that grid, the overall cost on that grid comes down. So at the end of the day, the customer wins because they pay a lower price. You mentioned the states and permitting, et cetera. I'll just share, the states are incredibly interested in new nuclear. If 5 years ago we would have had 12 bills that had anything to do with nuclear power in all of the state legislatures, I would have been impressed. Last year we had 200 bills about commercial nuclear power. States are trying to figure out how to incentivize bringing new nuclear power to their states, and that should tell us all something. This isn't just a worldwide hunger for nuclear, it's a state hunger right here in the United States, and they want to bring it, and they want to be part of the whole value chain. We just need to help unleash that.
Thanks so much. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. With that, we go to the gentlelady from Texas. Ms. De La Cruz is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing today. According to the Texas Comptroller, in 2022, there were 1,694,000 Texas jobs in the nuclear electric power generation industry, with an average wages of $175,140. The industry contributing an estimate of $1.4 billion in gross domestic product to the Texas economy. When considering nuclear energy jobs outside of the utility sector, such as those in manufacturing, construction, or professional services, the number of jobs jumps to more than 3,000. 3,000, it's incredible. Average wages of $175,000, those are jobs we need to be supporting. And it is in an industry that ultimately produces emission-free energy. You know, as I was looking at some of the information that we have here and that is given to us, I was reading a memo, and in our memo, it indicated that nuclear energy not only qualifies as low carbon source of energy, but it also possesses certain advantages over solar and wind. Now, the Department of Energy notes nuclear is a key source of baseload power that can compensate for the intermittence of nature of renewables. In addition, nuclear plants are able to run at maximum power more reliably than other energy sources, and their typical output means that they can produce as much as 4 renewable energy plants. And it's not just reliant on sun and wind only. With that being said, Mr. Judson, you had mentioned that there are missed opportunities in renewable energy, and your remarks lead one to assume that supporting nuclear energy means not supporting renewable energy. And as I look at the witnesses on the panel today, I see that their portfolios for the companies and businesses that they work for includes renewable energy, and that it's part of their portfolio and that they have invested. That being said, I'd like to ask you, Mr. Judson, you said that, quote, we are missing a piece of the pie in renewable energy by focusing on nuclear energy. Why do you think that Russia and China are investing so much in nuclear energy if the bigger slice of the pie is in renewable energy?
Sure. Well, I think what we've seen is actually a fairly narrow picture that's been painted. For instance, yeah, China is investing more in nuclear energy than any other country in the world right now, but they're investing far more in renewable energy than they are in nuclear. And wind and solar are far outpacing.
And I'm going to stop you right there. That is incorrect information. China in nuclear energy is assembling more than 1/3 of the reactors globally. China renewable energy, they have only done 20 billion a year over the past 10 years. So that is incorrect information, sir.
I'm afraid it isn't, but I can refer you to a source that will clarify it.
I would like that, please. I'll tell you what I believe is happening here. I will tell you that by having nuclear energies and putting monies into nuclear energy. That's why China's doing it. That's why Russia's doing it, because they see and they know that this leads to long-term relationships. Relationships that last 50 to 100 years. Relationships where other countries can ultimately become dependent on them. That's why they're putting money and time and effort into nuclear energy. That being said, I believe that China and Russia see the opportunity to have world energy dominance, and this is important to them. That's why they're in this space and focused in this space and not in the renewable energy space. Thank you, I yield back.
Lady yields back. That would go to the gentleman from California. Mr. Vargas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd say I did read that you're not going to be running for re-election. I think that that's sad for all of us. You've been a very knowledgeable person up here and a very good person to work with. Everyone respects you deeply, and we'll miss you, sir.
Thank you.
Now, I've been here for a while, and one of the things that I did remember is the fight we had over XM Bank. In fact, one of my colleagues on the other side who chaired the committee was very much against it. In fact, ultimately, he had to be rolled to be able to even fund XM Bank. And it was interesting because it was an ideological fight. I don't think it was one that was practical or scientific. It was just ideological. In fact, all the other banks said, we really need the XM Bank if we're going to compete nationally. And so here we are. We wasted some time. But I bring that up because ideology is interesting. I think it's gotten in the way of us looking at climate change for the last at least 2 decades. I know I've been preaching this, saying climate change is here, it's coming. And it wasn't until more recently that Mother Nature really made herself known with this extreme weather that I think it's made believers of most of us. But I normally don't think that people should get a pass on ideology. It should be science, with exception, and again, with exception, that is religion. I mean, I'm very devoutly Christian. I can't prove God, but I believe very deeply in him. That's just faith. Either you believe or you don't, and that's the way it is. But everybody else doesn't get a pass. It has to be scientific. And I say that because, Mr. Judson, you sort of paraded the horribles about nuclear. Said, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you said that there's safety, there's wars, invasions, theft of material, strategic placement. Even that kind of was interesting when you were saying where you might put them because maybe the enemy wouldn't attack, or they would from there attack because they wouldn't be bombed. But anyway, that was all interesting, expensive, and they're puny compared to the market. But, they're going to build them. I mean, I was just in Slovakia, and they're going to build them. And if they are going to build them, shouldn't we be involved in this? Mr. Judson.
Well, no, I actually don't think that we need to think about it that way. I think that, sure, Russia and China have their reasons for why they're pursuing exporting of nuclear reactors. China actually isn't doing that very much. Russia's dominating the nuclear export market. But again, it's a very small market globally. The development of renewable energy and related resources is far outpacing that. And so, what are we going to do? Are we going to go to other countries and say, well, we'll give you a different reactor than what Russia's going to give you with their financing package and taking your nuclear waste and all of that? Whereas, with renewable energy, we can offer them total energy independence. We can offer them affordable energy that they won't have to rely on another country to provide their fuel for.
Well, if I could just push back a little bit, because I'm not agnostic personally, but I'm agnostic when it comes to this. But they are going to build them. I mean, they are. And I mean, maybe it's not the big solution, but shouldn't we be involved in this? I mean, I think our safety is better than the Russians and the Chinese. I mean, why shouldn't we be involved?
What I think is that we should be involved. We should be very much involved in global energy infrastructure finance. But what the world is saying that it needs is not nuclear energy. The world is saying that countries need access to financing for renewable energy right now. And
Well,
this
I'm in
decade is
favor,
critical.
believe me, I'm in favor of renewables. I think that's the way to go, but they are going to build these things. I mean, you know, we can say that's just like climate change. I don't believe in it. We don't have to believe in it, dude. It's coming. I don't care what you believe. It's coming. And they are going to build these reactors. Let me ask somebody else. I mean, isn't that the case? I mean, they are going to build these. I was just in Slovakia. They told me they were going to build them. They're going to build them, aren't they?
Yes, and we hear from customers around the world that they want to build them, and they're ready to move forward with projects. And they're looking at the offerings that are available today. And many countries are just in the beginning phases of changing their policies back to pro-nuclear. So we've seen that happen as recently as this past year in Sweden. Others are moving forward. And as they pivot those policies, they're also then looking to try to find out how they could develop reactors faster than they have.
That's one of the things I know when I heard that they're small now, but it's just they could become big later on. I mean, that's the issue, right? I mean, just a few years back, renewables were small, and now they're gigantic. And by the way, again, I'm very much in favor of renewables. I think that's the way to go, and I do think we should invest more until we get to this fusion that somehow is going to be the magic bullet at the end of the day, or the magic pill, I guess I should say. But anyway, my time is up. I got 6 seconds. I thank you very much. It's been a great meeting, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. The gentleman from California's time has expired, and normally we go alternate Republican, Democrat, but we're out on our side of the aisle, other than Mr. Hill, who is not a member of the committee, but is here today to ask questions. And as a result, he asks last. So with that, we go to Mr. Nickel, the last Democrat on the dais to ask questions. He's recognized for 5 minutes, and then we'll go to Mr. Hill.
Thank you very much, Chairman Luetkemeyer, for holding this hearing today. Nuclear energy and the export of U.S. nuclear energy technology is important for our national security, our economic security, and for our climate. Let me just take a sec here to say this so everybody can hear me clearly. 2023 was the hottest year on record. We are in a climate crisis, and nuclear energy is a common sense path toward solving it. Additionally, Russia is the world's dominant global nuclear supplier. Russia's state-owned nuclear energy conglomerate currently has 70% of the worldwide export market for new reactor construction, and an order book accounting to $200 billion over the next decade. Chinese nuclear industry officials have said that China could build as many as 30 nuclear reactors abroad, worth $145.5 billion by 2023. Russia and China both funnel endless resources into nuclear exports for geopolitical influence. Meanwhile, U.S. companies are competing against foreign governments without meaningful support from the federal government. And the U.S. just can't fall behind. And that's why I'm drafting legislation to jumpstart nuclear financing at the Export-Import Bank. The Export-Import Bank already has the lending authority and functional capacity to finance overseas deployment of U.S. nuclear technologies. Last year, the Export-Import Bank approved $57.2 million in financing to help Romania lay the engineering groundwork to build 2 nuclear reactors. First question to you, Ms. Korsnick. What role do you think the Export-Import Bank could play in financing nuclear energy if their default rate limit were raised from 2% to 4%, and if civil nuclear facilities were included in the China and Transformational Exports Program?
I think it would be game-changing. In fact, it's one of our recommendations in our written testimony to legislate a permanent increase of XM's default rate cap from 2% to 4% and to expand the risk tolerance. Again, I think you stated it very well. We need to compete against the state-owned enterprises. We might not get all the way there, but we got to get in the zip code, because then they'll step back and say, well, okay, now who do I want to do business with? And in that race, the United States will win. The preference will be to work with the United States, but we have to get closer in what we can offer.
Thanks so much. Mr. McMurray, next question for you. Some have argued that financing nuclear energy comes at the expense of our climate. I certainly don't agree with that, but given nuclear is a clean energy, what's your response to that viewpoint?
Yeah, thank you, Representative. We're seeing a demand for more energy and more clean energy globally. And countries are going to want to build whatever options they have. It's not a renewables versus nuclear. We're going to need every clean energy technology we have. And so what we can focus on is making sure we have the policies in place to support U.S. companies to be able to export. And that can focus on at home, that also regarding the financing to make sure that the companies have that line of sight to say, we're going to build these manufacturing facilities. We know we have an order book abroad. We can address those policies so they can see that to build the facilities here at home, to support building reactors here at home, but then also be able to build them internationally as well.
Thanks so much. Ms. Korsnick, next, back to you. Given that Russia and Chinese nuclear enterprises enjoy access to state-backed financing, do you agree that the U.S. must work to level the playing field? And what are some of the critical policy priorities that we need to do to accomplish this?
Absolutely. We need to level the playing field. It was mentioned earlier, but I'll just add the mandate that XM's China and Transformational Exports Program, known as CTEP, accept greater loan risk across its portfolio and expand its transformational export areas to include civil nuclear facilities would be a great step forward. Also, items that were listed in the Civil Nuclear Export Act, I think they're very important and needed. It's an important step to helping U.S. gain ground in commercial nuclear technologies.
Thanks so much, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. With that, we go to Mr. Hills, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you so much for letting me wave on to this hearing. I've been a long, strong supporter of the United States using its sway with the international financial institutions to promote nuclear energy by investing in projects that as they do with certainly renewables like solar and wind. Nuclear is the ultimate carbon-friendly baseload and long-lasting power source. I'm a longtime supporter of Chairman McHenry's International Nuclear Energy Financing Act, which would require the Treasury Secretary to overturn a long-standing ban on nuclear assistance at the World Bank, which last considered a nuclear plant more than 6 decades ago. Recently, I was glad to see that the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development finally is taking steps to revisit its ban on nuclear energy financing, which follows the U.S. Development Finance Corp. In 2020, when it relaxed its own nuclear investment ban with bipartisan support from Congress. Last April, when Speaker McCarthy and a group, we were in Romania and in Poland, we certainly heard an earful about the need to expand their nuclear opportunities. And I will say this, also drill in the Black Sea on their natural gas reserves, which they've bought from the Austrians. And these are the kinds of things in a middle-income country like that where we need the IFIs to be fully participant in a long-term energy way. But yesterday I got a call from the energy policy leader in Romania who told me that they had agreed to go forward with a nuclear project in their country, and I think that's a really positive development. So I wish we had more projects ongoing, but let me start with Mr. McMurray. Have we seen progress with the DFC's decision since 2020?
Yes, we have seen progress since DFC lifted their moratorium recently in Poland by supporting the GE Hitachi small modular reactors there, as well as in Romania for the NuScale technologies. So it's very exciting to see this, and something to keep in mind is next year DFC will be reauthorized. And so how to kind of strengthen that unique equity function that it has to make sure it has the right expertise, it can support the right projects, and it's not limited by any other financing abilities for building larger projects is a big opportunity.
I think that's good. And I think obviously the Germans and the Japanese and the Americans have such a ability to do major consortium here. What about the idea of, is there anything else that our national labs can do to streamline the small modular nuclear design issue? Or do you feel like there is a template there that's perfectly fine and that we can press forward with that from a sales point of view for U.S. technology?
Yeah, the U.S. national labs are a true treasure to really improve that competitive advantage of the United States.
Yep.
The research that they do, the public-private partnerships that they have really makes the U.S. industry very competitive in being innovative and developing these new technologies. Broadening that to the international side, we can actually equate this to LNG, where the DOE, public-private partnerships, hydraulic fracking has really allowed the LNG industry to take off. The nuclear industry can do the same thing, and that's also where we can leverage our internal expertise at the Department of Energy and national labs to help countries learn about these technologies, to get comfortable with these technologies so we can export them.
So according to the Atlantic Council, the two countries that built 60% of new nuclear plants since 2019, I think, are Russia and India. Do you think that these steps on financing plus the small modular nuclear design element are going to allow Western countries like the United States to catch up and start taking market share there?
Yes, I think we have a variety of technologies, both large reactors.
But I think financing is a big piece. I mean, President El-Sisi told us that the reason they went Russian was purely based on the 4-reactor package, where they didn't pay a nickel until the 4th reactor was up and running, and then the payout was pretty long. I don't know if that technology is superior or not. Anybody want to address that?
I would say financing is critical, and making sure that we can offer competitive financing needs to happen.
Who has a suggestion on how we could make the financing even more competitive to benefit American manufacturing?
So I would weigh in that first thing that could be done is to help the World Bank and the other multilateral institutions lift their moratorium. When they say no to nuclear, it has an influence in trickling down throughout the banking system. So many institutions don't have the technical capacity to evaluate a project from scratch. They have to bring that in. And what they'll do first is look to an international bank like the World Bank to try to determine whether or not there's risk. And that's a policy decision that was made there.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm glad we have bipartisan support for this. I think it's critical. I think it's, if we're serious about climate, then we need to be serious about nuclear. I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. With that, we go to Ms. Kim, who's the vice chair of this committee. She's from California. Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Luetkemeyer, and I want to also thank Ranking Member for organizing this hearing, and thank you, witnesses, for being with us today. You know, I want to start by asking each of you a very quick quick answer. Would you rather live in a world where the U.S. and our allies are financing nuclear projects, or in a world where Russia and China are unilaterally providing lending for nuclear projects?
I'll pick the first answer.
The U.S.
Me too.
The second answer.
You know, when U.S. leadership and influence is absent, China and Russia do not hesitate to fill in the vacuum. Unfortunately, U.S. leadership had been absent for way too long in advocating for financing of nuclear projects. While long overdue, I must applaud the Biden administration's recent decision to encourage the World Bank and other institutions to support nuclear financing. We must support all of the above energy strategy. I do want to ask a question. The IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, it has called the nuclear power plants among the safest and most secure facilities in the world. And one analysis of the fossil fuels and low carbon energy sources showed that the risk to human life from accidents and air pollution were so small with nuclear power that they were comparable to renewables. So, Mr. Korsnick and Dr. Reinke, could you help us understand from an engineering perspective what makes nuclear so much less of a risk to human health than other energy sources?
I'll start, Ben, and then I'll hand it off to you. Basically, you'll start with there's no emissions from a nuclear power plant. And when we say carbon dioxide, so there's no carbon dioxide emissions, but also no nitrous oxides, no sulfur oxides. And those are some things that are pollutants that damage the environment, but they're also damaging to our health. And none of those emissions occur with the operation of nuclear power. You also get a lot of energy from a small amount of resource in nuclear power, and you get that round-the-clock, reliable energy.
I also want to say that nuclear broadly has adopted safety as its most important single cultural trait. In the United States, safety is paramount. It is the number one thing that all nuclear operators focus on. It's the number one thing we focus on at X Energy as well. Now, we have designed a reactor that is even safer than what we have today, and the reason we care to do that, despite the incredible safety case of today's reactors, is that it makes the reactor design simpler. You can get rid of a lot of things that you would build in and engineer to make sure that a reactor stays safe under all conditions, and that simpler design is then more economic. And so that's why we're bringing a new technology to market. The last thing to say is that we have done an analysis internally as well, trying to look at the overall life cycle emissions for our plants versus what we do, and we use the Argonne National Lab model, which is the standard for the Department of Energy. Now, typically, that model spits out an answer that is exactly what you said, which is that nuclear is comparable to renewables, and I believe there's only one type of renewable facility that would be, on a per megawatt hour basis, actually less than nuclear power. When we've run that model for our reactors, we actually come out lower than that even.
Thank you. Mr. McMurray, as you discussed in your testimony, the U.S. and over 20 allies pledged to triple global nuclear energy capacity from 2020 levels to 2050. That would be an unprecedented growth, more than 14 new 1,000 megawatt reactors every year starting in 2030. So the US and countries in Europe haven't deployed even close to that pace in recent decades, and some of the countries that made this pledge do not even have nuclear reactors at all. So how important is financing to reaching these levels of deployment, and how can we, the US and IFIs, play a role?
Thank you, Representative. Also, thank you for your support for geothermal permitting reform. Also appreciate that. It's a great question. The U.S. has to lead in this and has the industry to do that. It has the technical expertise and the regulatory expertise to be able to make that happen. It also has the ability to support the financing between XM and DFC, but it's also where the World Bank removing its moratorium is also necessary. The World Bank's one of the few entities that can support these large global infrastructure projects. And there are things that the World Bank can do. It can create a trust fund, which is actually a well-known thing at the World Bank. It funds about 2/3 of its analytical services are funded by these. And that can solve some of
according
these
to World Bank, around half of sub-Saharan Africa still lacks access to electricity. So is it realistic to expect Africa to obtain 100% access to clean electricity unless we expand nuclear energy on the continent?
Thank you. This is an area of the world that wants more energy, and it wants clean energy, and that's where you see China and Russia also looking at deploying their technologies there. That's an area where the U.S. has to be able to compete. Otherwise, these countries are going to look for those sources of financing that's available, and right now that is China and Russia.
Thank you. My time's up. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. With that, all of my colleagues today have asked all the questions we need to ask, hopefully, and we have some great answers from all of you. We thank you for your testimony today. One housekeeping item here, I would ask for unanimous consent to enter 2 articles from Foreign Policy Magazine to the record, which argue that our current approach to green finance in Africa is only harming the poor. These articles are entitled "Why False Energy Hopes Are Bad for Africa" and "The Dark Side of Climate Finance." Without objection, so ordered. With that, without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witness's chair, which will be forwarded to the witness for the response. Ask your witnesses to please respond as promptly as you can. Just one question for you before we leave here. Mr. Foster and I were talking a little bit ago, and he was saying that if a bomb should hit one of the plants that have these little modules, ceramic modules, or whatever you call them, would they destroy those modules, or would they just be blown to pieces? You just have to go collect all the little round objects around?
It's a great question. The easiest way to answer this is that we have also worked on a design for the U.S. Department of Defense, a mobile microreactor that was part of Project Pele, and we're funded to do work for them today. When DOD had originally envisioned the program, they required that all applicants use a TRISO fuel. Because they knew that if they put it in harm's way, it would be the safest nuclear fuel that you could have deployed. Now, we are designing our reactors to U.S. standards today, and typically the U.S. fleet has to be able to take, post 9/11, under rule from the NRC, a direct impact from a 747 fully loaded with jet fuel. And so all reactors are incredibly robust, and that's true, period. But with our fuel, if the pebbles were to leak out of the reactor after some sort of catastrophic accident, they remain that integrity. And when under tests in the past, even if you were able to break a sphere, one of those pebbles in half, the individual TRISO particles are retained and they're bonded to the graphite matrix. So when people have done crush tests, they're extremely robust, and the end of the crush test on the outside, you end up with 2 hemispheres, with the fuel bonded on the inside.
Very good. Question?
Oh, well, just, yeah, pretty much you answered what was going to be my question there. Now, one of the things that, another actually advantage that the TRISO approach has is you don't vent the long-lived radionuclides that are, one of the problems with conventional nuclear fuel is that if, a jetliner lands on it or something like this, there's a lot of stored, long-lived, volatile radionuclides sitting around that they're also in your fuel, but since they're contained in little tiny internal microspheres or whatever, then they actually don't come out, and that's a non-trivial advantage. Along with the fact that helium, has, as a coolant, has like 3 big advantages. First, it's non-corrosive. Secondly, it doesn't corrode, and thirdly, it doesn't corrode stuff by itself. And those are just having done helium designs and other designs in my, that is a huge deal.
So in layman's language, what you're saying is that the new models, the new designs are such that you really don't have a problem if there's some sort of a explosion or some sort of accident at this. They're designed so that it's going to be very, very minimal, if any, problems with that. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. And when we design the reactors, we take that design from the fuel out, and you make sure that you design a reactor so that under any accident scenario, even if you were to have a huge leak of all the helium at one moment, that safety case is such that the heat can dissipate, and it continues to dissipate from that hot radioactive fuel on the inside to the surrounding environment in perpetuity without any human intervention. And that's the key.
Yeah, what it means operationally is that terrorists could take over the control room, and there's not much they could do to make a Chernobyl-style accident.
There are only 4 operations in our reactor. So it's the most boring job in the world to be a nuclear operator at our reactors. And if you'd like, we can show you our control room simulator where you can play with the controls and try to run the reactor up and down in power. But there really are only 4 actions that are even physically possible with the reactor.
Very good. Well, thank all of the witnesses for today. With that, the hearing is adjourned.